Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining today. My name is Chris Mitchell, the Chief Technology Officer here at Inflow Communications, and I'll be leading today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the Mitel transitioning to virtual switches. So if you're a short-tail Mitel customer that has physical switches, we're going to kind of be talking about the reasons why you would do that and how you do that. If you haven't had a chance to hit our website and see upcoming webinars, we're getting ready to post I think the April ones go up next week. April webinars, we have a couple of data workshops coming up around Genesis Cloud next week. So if you are also Genesis Cloud or Contact Center customer, those would be some great options. We have some additional Mitel and Ring Central webinars coming out next in the April webinar list as well. All right, so a quick agenda here. I'll do a quick 2 slides on who is Inflow Communications, and we'll jump right in and talk about virtual switches. I'll save some time at the end for question and answer, and the last slide I'll have is contact us. So if there's questions that I can't answer, maybe you want to follow up with, we're always happy to hop on a call, discuss your physical or virtual, kind of switch environment, what your long-term plans are, with an after call with either your customer success manager or your sales rep. So you can reach out to them or reach out to us directly. We'll get you, we'll funnel that request over to your account manager. If you do have questions, feel free to put them into the question section in the webinar, and I'll try to answer them while I'm on the slides. A lot of them I'll probably answer during the presentation, but then, like I said, I'll try to save a few minutes at the end. Unless we have a bunch of questions, I shouldn't go over time today. So. All right, so who's Inflow Communications? So we've been around a little over, a little over 11 years, and our sole focus is contact center and unified communications. So we don't do data center, desktop supporting, that kind of stuff. We actually just recently announced on LinkedIn an acquisition of Peakview Communications out of Denver, Colorado. So we now have over 60 employees. We're headquartered in Portland, Oregon. We're still 100% remote. I think we have now 13 states with the Peakview acquisitions. I think we're in 13 or 14 states our employees are now. We have over 260,000 seats, customers that are employees that we support, over 800 customers with nationwide locations. A lot of those customers have worldwide locations as well. We operate with speed, urgency, and agility. We post our live support stats on our website, comments, everything like that from our customers. And the biggest push in the last 12 to 24 months we've been pushing is a full kind of life cycle guide where we can help customers with their UC contact center needs, but also their customer experience needs. We can help consult around the customer experience and improvements that can be made there. Our customers, span all kinds of different verticals. The big thing that that kind of brings all of our customers together is mission critical communications. Our customers all have strategic decision makers. They value partnerships, and they're in the kind of mid-market to enterprise, customer like size. Our partners, years ago, we were just, a short tail shop, and then, Mitel, kind of acquired them. Now we've kind of grown with our customers' needs around cloud and analytics and stuff like that. So we've picked up some different, products and stuff that we can integrate together and provide, different UC and contact center customer experience needs to all of our customers. So if any of these, pique your interest, reach out. We're more than happy to have a conversation and talk about them. All right, well, there's my quick little spiel. So we're going to jump right in now, and we're going to talk about virtual switches. So when we're talking about virtual switches with customers, it's more and more common for us to talk about that, customers' virtual environments are, multi-hosts, redundancies built in, SANs, all that kind of stuff. They really want to be able to take advantage of the investment they've made in their, in their virtual environments, to host their phone systems, their contact centers. So we're having more and more of these conversations. So the big question is, the customers ask is, why should I virtualize and what can I virtualize, right? So when we're talking about why, a lot of customers, they want to either reduce their hardware, that's in their racks and stuff like that. Maybe it's at remote locations. They want to stop supporting, hardware at remote locations where they don't have IT people. But a lot of people want to enhance the redundancy. And that's a really nice thing about virtualizing, inside of VMware Hyper-V, is that you can take advantage of clusters, or vMotion, some of those high availability, stuff that's built into the virtual platforms. You could take advantage of those and have it set up where a virtual switch can fail over, between multiple virtual hosts, or even between locations, in high availability mode or something like that. So you're not necessarily tied to one location anymore. When you have physical switches, that physical site loses power. You lose it, everything connected to that physical switch. So with the virtual environment, you have a lot more flexibility, to accommodate, internet outages or power outages, stuff like that. The other big reason is there's a lot of end-of-life hardware coming up for customers. More importantly, all of the SG switches that customers have. So SG, 30, 50, 50V, 90, 90V, T1K, 220 T1A, 220 T1, all of those SG24As, all of those switches are scheduled to be end of life in June of 2023. So you got a little over 2 years still on this, but a lot of our customers are planning out their communication roadmaps 2+ years anyway. And if it's either upgrading their existing system, or maybe it's a hybrid environment where they want some stuff on site, some in the cloud, or maybe some customers that they want a full cloud environment. We're working with customers to kind of help plan that out, and that's one big push for it. There's also going to be another list of hardware. That's the June 2023 is going to be a big end of life, hardware. Right now, there's all a batch of phones and stuff that are also going to be set to be end of life, unless Mitel decides to lengthen that. But right now, like all of the 230 phones, which a ton of our customers have, I would probably say it's still the majority of our customers have that phone out there, is set to be end of life that same date. So they may work beyond that date, but there'll be no support, or anything like that from Mitel, and from Inflow to be able to provide support on the hardware. The other reason a lot of customers are moving to virtualization is they're moving off of their older, PRIs, and they really want to move to SIP for redundancy purposes, failover purposes, and and sometimes cost savings. Instead of having a PRI at every single site, maybe they want to have SIP at 3 of their main locations, and then all the sites, will access the SIP trunking at those 3 sites. And there's a cost savings, a lot of time that you can get from consolidating from PRIs to SIP. So what can be virtualized? In this case, we're just talking switches. Obviously, if we're talking what can be virtualized, then we would start talking about what all the headquarters servers, DVSs, contact center, redundant contact center, all that kind of stuff. But we'll save that for another day. From a switching perspective, we can virtualize the primary phone switch. So the primary phone switches would be, say, like an SG30, 50, or 90. That would be a phone switch. The phone switch's responsibilities is, phones get assigned to it. They assist phones with call buildup and teardown. They also provide routing tables for the phones, but then they also provide capabilities for hunt groups. So when a hunt group gets called, they hit the switch, and the switch says, "Oh, this is a call for extension 1234, which is the reception hunt group, and I need to ring Chris's phone and Billy's phone 4 times. If they don't answer, route the call to the auto attend or something like that." So that's all done at the hunt group. The hunt groups are all sort of the switch level. So that's primary switch functionality. The other thing you can virtualize is spare switches. So if you wanted to have backups to your physical switches, because maybe you're not quite ready to replace your physical switches, or maybe you have analog needs that stop you from replacing all your physical switches, you can spin up spare virtual switches. So that physical switch goes down, all of the phones and hunt groups assigned to it can fail over to a spare switch. The nice thing about a spare switch is there's no cost to that. Mitel doesn't charge a license for a spare switch. They charge, for primary switches or anything in full production used every day, they charge a fee for. But for backup spare switches, they don't charge anything for those. The last thing we'll talk about here, what you can virtualize, is virtual trunk switches. So you have all those T1Ks, at every location that you have a PRI connected to. Maybe you want to replace all those and go SIP. We virtualize the trunk switch. We work with the carrier to get us to move over to SIP trunking, and then all those T1Ks can go away, and those copper PRIs can go away. Now we can use SIP based, either with a dedicated internet connection from your carrier, or maybe over your own internet connection with multiple different carriers, so you can provide some redundancy there. So those are the big three things that we're talking with customers as far as what they're looking to virtualize is primary switches, spare switches, and virtual trunk switches. The nice thing is Mitel realizes that every customer is gonna need to replace their switches, and they've started promo pricing for customers to help them migrate off of physical switches over to virtual. So you can reach out to your customer success manager, your sales rep, and talk about promotions around or discounts around migrating off of your physical switches. From a support aspect, what occurs is you purchase your new virtual licensing, and then on your next renewal, you can then remove your physical switches off of your support renewal. So from a cost perspective, I would say for most customers, there is a slight reduction in your support cost on a yearly basis because the virtual licensing is a little bit less expensive to support from on the support contract than your physical switches. So when you go to renew, that is one thing you want to take into account is once you renew, you want to remove any of the physical switches that aren't in production anymore, off of your support renewal. So you're not paying Mitel for warranty coverage on those physical switches that you're not using anymore. So this is probably the biggest thing we talk about with customers is, okay, what does it look like to migrate to a new virtual phone switch? Is it 10 hours of work? Is it an hour worth of work? And typically, I would say for most of our customers, if they're starting it, is we'll usually we'll quote it like 2 hours of inflow professional services to help you out and kind of help you walk you through the first one or the first two, and then it's pretty easy for you to replicate and kind of move forward, replacing the rest of your physical switches with virtual on your own. So we're just talking phone switch here first, and we'll talk the virtual trunk next. So the first thing you have to do is you got to buy some licensing, because otherwise you'll be in license violation once you spin up and start using it. So virtual phone licenses are sold in packs of 1, 50, or 200. The pricing gets cheaper per license the bigger bundle you buy. So if you're gonna you're going to need a couple hundred of them anyway. Buy them in packs of 200. It's going to get you your best price break because the bigger the bundle, the bigger the discount on those. So the other thing, when you buy like an SG90, that SG90 can handle 90 phones. Well, when you do virtual phone, you have to license the number of devices that are going to register to that virtual switch. So if you have 67 phones, then you could buy 67 licenses, or maybe you want to buy 100 licenses or something like that. But you do have to buy the set number of devices that are going to register to that virtual phone switch. And things that register to a virtual phone switch is a regular physical phone. A soft phone also counts. So if a user has a physical phone and a soft phone, you'd want to buy 2 licenses for that user. The nice thing about soft phones is that it only registers when it's in use. So if I'm using my soft phone right now, it'd be tying up a license. But if I shut down my client or turn off my soft phone, I free up that license for somebody else. So a lot of time for soft phone customers is you don't necessarily have to buy every single user a soft phone if they're not going to be using it at the same time. Maybe you buy 75% of the user's soft phone, a license who are going to be using soft phones, because then you figure 25% of the time aren't going to be using it. So there's a little bit of, kind of guesswork there that you have to do. Other things that register as a virtual phone would be if you have any third-party like Polycom devices, conference phones or something like that, or if you're using the mobility client. Every user who's using mobility will register their mobility client will register as a virtual phone. So just some things to take into account when you're looking at it. You can also just look at your existing physical switches and see how many devices are registered per switch. That would give you a really good understanding of how many virtual licenses you need to purchase. And that's typically what I recommend. Look at your current usage, make a decision based on what's currently registered to the system. Once you've purchased the licensing and you put the license key into your system, then you can download the ISO from your director. So if you're on Connect, which I think most of our customers are on Connect, it's not the gear tab, it's the tab next to it where you could do software downloads, and then you could download the ISO for virtual switches. It's one ISO for a physical or a virtual switch, regardless of it, because they run the same operating system. So you download that ISO, then you open up that ISO in either VMware or Hyper-V. And once you mount it and open that ISO up, it runs through a little wizard, that'll have you set up the headquarters IP address and stuff like that inside of it. Once you've spun that up, you want to write down the IP address that you assign to that virtual switch and the MAC address, because you're going to need that to put it in a director. Once you've kind of wrote down that stuff, you're done on the hypervisor side. There's nothing else you have to configure in VMware Hyper-V. Once you've spun it up, gave it an IP address, and told it the headquarters IP address, everything else on that switch will be managed via director. So you're not logging in and out of VMware Hyper-V all the time to manage that thing. That image is completely managed from by the PBX. So once you spun that up, then you log into your director site, and you add that virtual switch to the director. So when you go to add it, you're going to have to choose between adding it as a primary switch, a spare switch, or a trunk switch. And once you select that and go in and add it, that's where it's going to have you put the IP address and MAC address in. Once you've added that, it'll have you reboot that switch to get a firmware. Once that firmware is applied, that's when that switch knows what type of switch it is. Up until that firmware getting pushed to it, it's just a generic virtual switch. But then the firmware pushes it either as a primary switch, a spare switch, or a trunk switch. So once you've rebooted and got a firmware to it, then now it's a live virtual switch, and you can start your testing. What I usually tell people is get it set up, and then maybe just move the IT phones over. Move some of those users over to maybe move an IT hunt group or something over to it. Then you can do some testing on it, make sure everything is working fine on it. The biggest thing that you have to take into account is network routing. So whatever IP address you give those virtual switches, your desktops for soft phone purposes or in your physical phones have to be able to route to that network. So if it's in like a server VLAN or something like that, you just need to make sure your network routing allows the IP address you gave the virtual switch to talk to to the other devices in your phone system. Once you've kind of tested it maybe with IT for a few weeks or something like that, then you're able to go ahead and start migrating more users in hunt groups off of that. The easiest way to do that is from like the IP phones page, where you can look at all of the phones on a switch, and you can highlight all of them, and then you can just say move all of these phones from this switch over to the new virtual switch. You can move all the phones in one shot, which is nice. Once you've moved all the phones over, and one note too, when you migrate off a user's phone, it will drop a call. So when you're migrating phones and stuff like that, you typically want to do it, either in small batches that are on the phone by looking at their statuses before you do it, or at the end of a business day or something like that, because you will drop a user's call when you migrate their phone between switches. Once you've migrated the user's phones, then you need to go in to your hunt groups page and sort your hunt groups by switch and make sure and see what hunt groups are stored on the switch that you're trying to remove, because you need to migrate the hunt groups over to the new virtual switch. The good news is the virtual switches have more resources when it comes to hosting of hunt groups. So you can actually put more hunt groups on a virtual switch because it has more resources than the physical switches do. So in order to do that, you simply go into your hunt group, and there's a drop-down list for the switch that it's assigned to. When you do the drop-down, you'll see your new virtual switch, whatever you named your virtual switch will show up in that list. So then you can move the hunt group over. Same thing there. When you move a hunt group between switches, it will drop calls in the hunt group. So be careful what time of day you reassign that hunt group to between switches. So now you've moved your phones and your hunt groups over, and you're right now ready to remove that physical switch from the system. So then you can go into your platform hardware primary, find the switch you want to remove, and then delete it. The good thing about the system will not let you delete a switch that still has a hunt group or a phone, or any kind of SIP registration or something pointed to it. So it will throw an error if you try to delete it and it's still being used in the system. If it lets you delete it, you know that there was no references in the database to that switch any longer, and then it'll be completely removed from the system. Once you've kind of completed removing those switches from the system, that's where you want to notify your customer success manager of any switch models and the serial numbers, because that's how Mitel tracks everything by serial number that's been removed, so they can then flag them for the next support renewal, and they can make sure and pull those off of the support renewal. So like I said, you're not paying for warranty coverage on those switches. Just to kind of give you an idea, in most cases, like an SG90 is typically runs about $400 a year for the warranty coverage for most customers on an SG90. So every 90 you remove your support contract, if you forget to remove them, you're gonna pay an extra $400 per year, on your support contract on average. So you definitely just want to notify your customer success manager of the switches you're pulling off, so they can remove them from your support contract. All right, got a couple questions. I answered 2 of them already as part of that, but I do have one other question here that says, is end of life and end of sale the same date? So no, the end of life is typically 5 years from the end of sale date. So under Mitel's agreement with customers and everything like that, is they'll guarantee that they support any product for 5 years from the last sale date. He's Brennan qualified or specified. End of support and end of life are the same things, yes. So you have end of sale when they stop selling a product, and then 5 years from that date is typically the end of support, end of life for a product. They have extended it a few times in the past and said, hey, we're going to leave a firmware for these model phones in the PBX, but we won't support them. We won't support them any longer. And they have done that a few times where they didn't delete the firmwares for certain model switches or phones, but they just said hey, this is an end of support product. You're free to use it in the system, but you can't open a support case or anything on those. And since the SG switches in the 230s are the switches and phones that I would say the bulk of customers still have in the system, we are either hoping for an extension on the end of life into support option, or at least we're hoping they'll allow to leave the firmwares in for those devices, so the customers could continue using them if they need to, if they want to, beyond that date. But until we typically when they get a year out from that is typically when they'll do another bigger announcement, and they'll list exactly every single piece of equipment they are planning to end of life into support, at that year. So we probably won't know until June of next year what exactly they're looking to replace. Let's see, I answered. Okay, 2 more questions that came in here. It says, is there licensing for V switches per device? Is there licensing per V switch and per device, or just per device? So the virtual switch itself is not licensed. It's solely licensed on the number of devices. So I could buy a 200 pack of virtual phone licenses, and I could split those 200 phone licenses on 1 virtual phone switch or 100 virtual phone switches. There's no limitation on the number. They don't license the actual virtual switch. They just license, the number of devices spread across those virtual switches. So you could do 1 virtual switch, or you could do 200 virtual switches with 1 license assigned to each if you wanted to. It'd be crazy, but you could. Let's see, one other question here that came in is, what are your music on hold options? So music on hold options with the virtual switch are obviously a little bit different because there's no physical jack spot to plug in a music on hold device. If you're physically using a music on hold device, you will have to keep physical switches so you can plug into that. If you've already switched, or you want to switch to a file-based music on hold, you can upload music files to your headquarters server, and then you can do file-based music on hold. And that can be file-based, allows you to specify files by user group or by phone number that's dialed. So if you wanted to play different music on hold by each phone number that somebody dials, or by the user group, you can do that with file-based music on hold. But if you need a jack, if you need to physically plug something in for music on hold, you'd have to keep a physical switch. But I would say most of our customers are in the process or already moved to the file-based music on hold, and they do it from the server. All right, so now we're going to talk real quick here on the trunk switch. In the trunk switch and a phone switch, like I said, it's the same ISO image and everything like that. They're licensed very similar, but you just license the number of trunks that you're going to use. So virtual trunks are only SIP. So if you're moving from PRI to SIP, this could be a good use case. The licenses are sold in packs of 1, 25, and 50. And similar to the question earlier is, It doesn't matter. I don't have to pay a license for the virtual trunk switch. I just have to license it. So if I buy a 50 pack, I could have one virtual trunk with 50, or I can have two virtual trunk switches with 25 each. You can license those out however you want. The process follows you. If you're looking a very similar way, I download the ISO, I open it up in VMware Hyper-V, I write down the IP and MAC, I add that switch to the system, and this is where it gets a little bit different once we hit step 5, is now I need to create a new trunk group, because if I'm on a PRI, I can't use my PRI trunk group with SIP, so I need to create a new SIP trunk group. And then once I create that new SIP trunk group, I'll tell it how many trunks it's going to have. Is it going to have 10 trunks? Is it going to have 20? Is it going to have 50? Is it going to have 100? Whatever I need there. Once I've added the number of individual trunks to the system, then I have the ability to work with my carrier on a port date. Say, okay, great. I need to port all my DIDs from the PRI to the SIP trunk group. And that could be your same carrier, or it could be a new carrier. If it's the same carrier, it's really easy because it's not really a port, it's a trunk group move. But if you're switching carriers, or maybe you need a recommendation on a SIP carrier, reach out to your CSM. We have a few carriers that we recommend that we do business. We've done business with customers, or other customers are using that we like because they're easy to do, easy to work with and stuff. So we have a few that we'll recommend over to you to look at and get a price comparison to make sure you're getting a good deal. So then you work with your carrier on the port date. The biggest thing about moving from PRI to SIP, and I would say the biggest pain, is that if you have 100 DIDs, those 100 DIDs have to be removed from the PRI trunk group and reassigned on the SIP trunk group. It's a pain. So we had a customer who had like 700 or 800 DIDs, and we had to reassign all 700 or 800 DIDs. We could do the user ones on an import and reassign those on an import, but you have to manually assign like hunt groups, work groups, auto attendant DIDs. They have to be manually reassigned on in the director. So that's usually the biggest problem, or time consuming thing when you're moving from PRI over to SIP. So once you've ported the numbers and everything off of it, then we can go ahead and remove the PRI trunk group and the switch from the system, and then remove that from your asset list, so you're not paying for warranty coverage any longer on those. Let's see here. A couple questions that came in. Is there a migration path for licensing to virtual? So yeah, and so if you have physical switches, or if you have some physical SIP licensing, they do have promotions to help customers migrate off of physical switches to virtual. They kind of vary based on how many licenses you want. The more typically the more licensing you're purchasing, the bigger the discount that we've been able to negotiate with Mitel. So, but yeah, they do have existing promos, and Mitel has said they expect to keep those promos going all the way through 2023 as their plan anyway. Obviously, they run quarter to quarter with us, the discounts. They say, yeah, but they've had them going for 2 quarters in a row now, and they plan to keep those going. So if you are looking to go to virtual, reach out to your CSM. They'll work on a count, and they can work on a pricing and a discount from Mitel to help you migrate those over. And in some cases, they've been at least 50% discounts in a lot of cases that they've been able to negotiate for customers. Let's see, another question that came in. It says, if I buy 50 licenses, assign 25 to one switch, 25 to switch 2, can I add a third switch that is a redundant switch? So yes, what your third switch would be a spare switch in that case, because if it's not in production, you don't need to license it. So you would spin up the third switch as a spare. There's no cost for a spare switch. The spare switch could then back up your 2 production switches that have 25 and 25 on them. I guess I should clarify that. If you're talking about phones, yes. Trunk switches get a little bit different because they don't have a spare trunk switch. The Mitel short-haul system, for trunking, everything is in production. So if you wanted to have a third switch for trunking, you would have to license 25 for the third one in order to have like a kind of hot standby or a standby for your trunking. But from a phone perspective, yes. Your third one can be a spare for phones and fail over at no cost. For trunking purposes, they would have to be 3 production switches, and we'd have to buy, licensing for that third one, to match the first 2 if you wanted redundancy that way. So good question there on there, because I don't think I specified earlier that the redundant or the spare switches are only for phone, not for trunking. The other thing we run into a lot of time when we're talking virtual switches for customers is when you're doing trunking, if you want 2 sites and you want 100% redundancy, but maybe your carrier says, well, I'm going to give you 100 trunks between 2 sites, and we have load balancing kind of in failover. In order to really take advantage of the carrier's 100% redundancy, is you would have to license 100 virtual trunk switches at each site. If you just license 50 on each site to load balance them, if one site goes down, the other site only has 50 licenses, so you'd only be able to take half your capacity. So when we're talking SIP trunking, we end up usually having to over-license the Mitel system in order to take advantage of most carriers' full redundancies. So in this case, if they had 100 trunks total, I would buy 100 at one site, 100 at another site, and then regardless of which site failed, the other site could take 100% of the capacity. So that's the only thing that's tricky when we're talking trunks, is a lot of time we end up having to kind of buy our trunk licensing in order to take advantage of the full SIP redundancies that carriers offer. Perfect. We're right at time here. So I think I got one other question that came in, that just came in here. So it says, if I have 100 trunk licenses on one switch, is it possible to split it to 50 and have the other 50 in a DR at another site? Is it possible to reassign them without interrupting production? So if you have 100 switches and one site goes down, you can make that live change and hop in the system and build additional trunks on that secondary site. The biggest key is if your headquarter site goes down, you can't make those changes in Director to push them out to a secondary site. So that's the only thing we typically run into is, yes, you can make those changes on the fly immediately to reassign licenses, but if it's your headquarter site that goes down, you can't make those changes, to be pushed out to that secondary site. If my headquarters is in Oregon and my Seattle, site dial tone goes down, great. I can add additional 50 trunks or something on my Portland one to take the additional volume, because my headquarters server is still up and it can communicate to the switches. But that's the only risk you run, is if the headquarters site is the one that's down, you'll no longer be able to make changes. So your switches will be stuck at the licenses in the trunks that are built on them until the headquarters comes back up. So then I can build in a change and push that change out to the system. So I'm more than happy to kind of talk through that, Christian, if that's something you want to talk through, kind of what the DR and redundancies look like around switching to SIP, because there's a lot of stuff the carrier can do, and we like to try to mimic and take advantage of any redundancy the carrier can offer. So we'll kind of design out the PBX system to take advantage of those redundancies and figure out if it's 2 sites or 3 sites, redundancy. We can build those out. We're more than happy to have those conversations with customers. And also with carriers, if you need a sales engineer to hop on a call with a carrier to talk through what they offer, we're more than happy to hop on there, talk through that, figure out what's the best setup between the carrier, in your Mitel system. So get in touch with us if you have questions. If you want to have a conversation around that, I would say my sales engineering team probably does at least 5 SIP calls a week with customers to kind of talk through the migration of SIP and how they can take advantage of SIP from a redundancy perspective. So we're more than happy to hop on and talk, have those conversations with customers and even with with the carriers, like I said. So hit us up at Contact Inflow Communications, or email your CSM or your sales rep, account manager, and they can give you a link to book a time with a sales engineer to talk through any questions that you have on this. I appreciate everybody's time today and look forward to talking to you in the future. Thank you. Have a good day.